If you're an old school Sega fan, then there's a very good chance that you're also a fan of Sega's arcade games. With the release of the Genesis, aka the Mega Drive, around the world, Sega made the push to truly bring arcade experiences to home consoles, not just with their own games, but also with titles from Capcom and other third parties, with games like Ghouls and Ghosts and Strider being every bit as important and impressive as their own titles like Altered Beast and Golden Axe. And no, we don't need to do the thing again where I complain about Altered Beast. While it wasn't perfect for a launch and pack-in title for the console, it clearly got the job done. But while the impressive console ports that the Genesis got certainly put Sega on the map, especially in the United States before the release of the Super Nintendo, Sega wasn't exactly new to putting out ports of their arcade games when the Genesis debuted. While the Master System wasn't exactly a success stateside, due to their own issues and some things out of their control, Sega did try to do their best to bring their arcade game hits home, even if they only had 8 bits at their disposal. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and just randomly got dropped here due to searching for footage of some of the most insane people on the planet. That's right, the people that compete in the ultimate endurance race, the Ultra Marathon. And yes, I had to be very careful as to what photo to insert there, as to not choose one that would need a content warning. Trust me, don't actually Google Ultra Marathon unless you have a pretty strong stomach. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, rather than keep up with people that think it's actually a good idea to run for more than 26 miles in a row, I'm actually instead out to collect and review not just video games that got butchered by Sega to save money, oops, sorry, spoiler, but also the nearly 1,280 other titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. If you hadn't actually read the title of this video, you might be somewhat confused by that previous few paragraphs, so I'll remind everyone that today we're taking a look at the Master System title, Enduro Racer. And while the game does involve reference to a race that you need great endurance to complete, it's instead about a race on a motorcycle rather than the bloody stumps that a runner will be left with after trying to complete one of those crazy races. Again, don't Google it. Enduro Racer started out life in the arcades as an early member of Sega's Super Scalar series of arcade games, running on a slightly modified version of the same arcade board that was used for Hang On and Space Harrier. Being that it was originally a Super Scalar game and we're discussing a Master System title, I've of course got some concerns about what Sega would be able to do to port this game to the much less powerful hardware in the Master System. As we've seen on this channel previously, sometimes Sega has been reasonably successful at this, specifically with Outrun and Space Harrier, but then you run into a title like Thunderblade and, well, it just doesn't always work out. So what does Sega have up their sleeves this time? Were they able to replicate the arcade game just in a lower fidelity? Or do we have something completely new on our hands that just happens to be utilizing the Enduro Racer moniker? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package.
Okay, and this is my copy of Enduro Racer for the Master System. I've had this copy for a while, but like many of the games in my collection, I haven't actually played it just due to time restraints. Unfortunate, but on the other hand, usually that means when I do finally get around to reviewing the game, it's a completely fresh look at the title. This particular copy is in pretty good shape. The hang tab has been removed from the top, but other than that and some very minor scratching on the back, it's fully intact, and the manual and cartridge are in good shape as well, as you'll see in a minute. Definitely no reason to replace this copy for a better one, but if you happen to want a copy for your collection, it can be had fairly cheaply, with US copies going for around $20 and PAL versions going for just slightly cheaper. There is one caveat here, however, as Enduro Racer was one of the Master System games that got a later re-release, effectively a greatest hits version, I believe to coincide with the release of the Master System 2, and unlike re-releases for other more modern consoles, In the case of the Master System releases, which are usually signified now by a bold black font on the cover, and possibly a blue rather than red label on the cartridge, these versions sell for substantially more money as they're quite rare, so something to keep an eye out for if you happen to be hunting around. Regardless of the font for the title, both the North American and PAL versions of the game use the same cover art, which goes back to the days of the very simplistic Master System cover art, and in this case, there's just a rough sketch of the front of a dirt bike hitting some sort of mogul or rock. In the past, I've been pretty dismissive of this minimalist art style, but of the covers that I've seen done like this, I think this is one of my favorites, as at least there's a good use of color here. When comparing to the Japanese version of the game, I almost always think the Japanese version got the better art, and I'd say that here as well. However, even the Japanese version in this case is just kind of blah, as it's just a guy on a dirt bike. But wait, what's this? The US PAL cover refers to the game as being a mega cartridge, meaning just 1 megabit, but the Japanese version clearly is labeled with 2M. That seems like a bad omen, and I'll definitely get more into that during the rest of the review. Flipping over the rear cover, and we've got a pretty standard 2-screenshot layout from that particular time period. The screenshots are of a decent quality for 1987, and they show off 2 different levels from the game. But for the first time, you can see that clearly, while Enduro Racer shares its name with the Superscalar arcade game, things are going to be a little bit different here, as the action has apparently shifted to an isometric perspective instead of the third person behind the bike camera that you might be expecting. The flavor text below is fine and tries to hype the game up, but it could have used some exclamation points. I do like the closing line of, "Now grip those gears, spin those wheels, and take the lead to victory," though. If you insert your own punctuation there, it really gets that excitement going. Opening up the box, and there is a portrait-style US manual. While this isn't a game that really needs a manual, there's tons of nice details in here about specifically how much slower you might be if you don't hit a jump right, the exact amount of damage you'll take depending on what kind of trouble you get into on the course, the various parts and items that you can buy to improve and fix your bike, and then there's even a nice description of each of the 5 areas in the game that you'll be racing through. Again, the game is simple enough that you can probably play it without this, but it's nice to have, and just shows how even a little bit of effort in the manual can show in the final product. Well, that's my copy of Enduro Racer. Let's plug it in and see if I can do my best Jeff Ward impression. If you've never seen or played the arcade version of Enduro Racer, well, that's not too surprising, as the game certainly isn't anywhere near as common as Sega's other Superscalar racing games. In fact, you can count me in on that group, because while I have seen the machine, most recently at Galloping Ghost, I've never actually played it. Having said that, if you're not familiar with the original Enduro Racer, the easiest way to describe it is that it's hang-on, but with a dirt bike instead of a sport bike. It's a 5-stage affair, and while there are other riders on the course, they really don't matter, as it's just you against the clock to determine if you can make it through all the stages to the eventual end goal. The only real difference between the games is that with it being a dirt bike-based game, there are now ramps in the tracks, and for best results when going over the ramps, you'll want to pull up on the handlebars to perform a wheelie before hitting your jump. Perhaps that similarity to Hang-On is part of why Enduro Racer didn't really catch on, and with Super Hang-On coming out less than a year later, arcade motorcycle fans quickly had a new shiny thing to be distracted by. This didn't stop the home computer ports though, and Enduro Racer, like many other Sega arcade games, hit the Atari ST, Commodore 64, Amstrad CPC, and ZX Spectrum by virtue of a licensing deal with Activision. I'm sure someone who's more familiar with those ports and some of those computers might disagree with me, but I personally didn't think any of them were very good, at least based on the footage that I saw of them from YouTube, with perhaps the Atari ST version being passable, and then of course not having any sound effects. I did find it odd that there was no Amiga version, and maybe someone that knows the UK home computer scene better than me can chime in as to why that possibly was. Arcade hit or not, Sega still desperately needed games for the Master System to compete with Nintendo, and especially a certain hit named Excitebike, which definitely seemed to have some of the same action featured in Enduro Racer, just presented in a different way. However, Sega also knew the limitations of their 8-bit console, especially in regards to trying to port over a title from their near state-of-the-art superscalar arcade boards, and smartly decided to go in a different direction than what Activision did for those home computer ports. Instead, Sega decided to turn Enduro Racer into an isometric racing game, which allowed the game to run much better on weaker hardware, but also still have for a pseudo 3D environment whereby racers could take to the sky over jumps in the course in the same way that they did in the arcade version. But this wasn't the only change made to the game. Now, rather than having to race through a series of 5 stages concurrently, the goal instead was to make it through 10 stages, but now one at a time. This one at a time process allowed Sega to implement some other changes to make the game a bit deeper, and due to that, now the game features a power-up and a health system. You still have to make it to the end of the course before time expires, and the better you do, the more time that you can carry over to the next level. But now, depending on how many opponents that you pass during the course, you'll earn points that can be spent on upgrading your bike. And I say opponents there, and perhaps that's not necessarily the right word, because just like in the arcade game, you're not really competing with them, but you do get something for passing them, so I guess that's close enough. Earn enough points, and you're given the option to purchase one of 5 different parts between races, split into 2 tiers. You can either invest in handling, accelerating, or tires at the lower cost tier, or if you've saved up enough points, you can also either purchase a better motor or suspension. The upgrades all do seem to work, although depending on which ones you choose, you may find that they're not that useful. Also, since not all the tracks are laid out the same way, some upgrades are better suited to being used on specific tracks. Say for instance, maybe one track has more debris, one track has more turns, one track has more jumps, etc. For my money, I think the upgrade that I got the most use out of was the upgraded suspension, because while it's nice to be able to accelerate faster or simply go faster with a better engine, having the upgraded suspension makes short work of all the jumps and keeps you from losing speed if you don't happen to time one of them correctly. However, there are some caveats here. The first is, all of these upgrades are temporary. So say you spend the extra money for a suspension or engine upgrade, well, you better have really wanted it just for that one race, because it will be gone before the next one. I suppose this keeps you from possibly having too powerful of a bike, but I don't know, I think I would have preferred permanent upgrades that just cost more. Compounding all that, if you crash during a race, either by riding into a hole or possibly inadvertently running into one of the other bikes or buggies, you will lose your upgrade when your bike respawns. Nothing like saving up for a better motor and losing it 5 seconds into a race because the computer decided to drive like a total jerk. One other thing that's important to keep an eye on is the health system that I mentioned a few paragraphs ago. In riding through the courses, there's plenty of hazards that one can run into, with of course the worst outcome being crashing your bike. Any of those hazards will slowly increase your bike's damage meter from 0 to 99. In a pretty unique design that I actually like the idea behind, as long as you can keep that damage below the max, you're fine, and will have no problem racing along like normal. But if you hit 99, all of a sudden the game's clock will start to increase twice as fast. And with the courses that average 50 seconds to complete, well, you had better hope that you had plenty of time saved up, or else it will be the end of the line, and you'll have to start over from scratch. To combat this, there is one other thing you can buy, and that's an item. And no, I'm not trying to be intentionally vague, it literally is marked as just an item. And what it appears to be is a randomly picked part that, depending on which part you get, will heal your damage, with some parts only healing 4, and then going all the way up to 50 if you're lucky. And I do say lucky because despite what the manual says in both the Japanese and then North American / PAL versions of the game, it doesn't appear that you have any control over what item is purchased. And even if you have extra points, you can only purchase one item between the races. So you end up having to strategize a bit and try to figure out when it makes the most sense to take your chances on an item versus a performance enhancing part, or then just saving your points. I didn't really care for the randomness here. I would definitely have preferred this to be a bit more straightforward, and clearly the people that wrote the manual weren't necessarily on board with it either, as the manual states explicitly, decide which item you need, then choose it, even though you're not given that option. Now, I mentioned the Japanese and then North American / PAL versions there on purpose, because in an amazingly dumb decision, they are effectively different games. Or they're the same game, but the North American PAL version is decidedly cut down to fit in a smaller 1 megabit cartridge. This is what I was referring to in the cover section when I pointed out that the Japanese version is labeled as 2 megabits. Due to this, while both games still have 10 levels, the Japanese version has 10 different levels, while in the West we got 5 levels that are simply repeated with more competitors and more expensive parts. There's other small differences too, like the ending is different in the Japanese version, with a map displaying showing how far you've made it through all the courses, and then a picture celebrating your win, while the North American / PAL version instead only has the somewhat goofy motivational text that displays when you complete the arcade version. The whole situation is unfortunate, and while I understand that Sega was trying to cut costs here with a smaller cartridge, the Japanese version, with the full assortment of tracks, no part cost increases, and the non-cheesy ending, is infinitely better. I love to throw blame at Nintendo for Sega's failures over the years, especially in the NES era, but there were times that Sega was clearly their own worst enemy, and this decision is a great example of why, as it's a total step on the rake moment on their part. Regardless of which version of the game you pick up, the game plays very well and is incredibly simple. You basically have gas and brakes, and then can move either side to side or pop a wheelie, just like in the arcade. You never really need to use the brakes, and the manual even warns you against it, so I almost wonder why they even included it. Most of the game really just comes down to avoiding things by moving left and right, and then learning the time to hit the wheelie to take jumps. Even when you do crash, usually it's something that probably could have been avoided, although I did find myself cursing the computer for being seemingly suicidal more than once. I've already gone over how the graphics in Enduro Racer are reimagined from the arcade version, and even though the isometric presentation is definitely simpler, I actually like it, especially for a 1 or 2 megabit game from 1987. The action moves fast, and while the stages do tend to have some repeated elements, I like how each one has a unique theme. This is definitely where the North American / PAL version pales in comparison, because having 10 levels that all look different is of course twice as good as only having 5. I also like the small details of, like, say, your clothing moving in the wind as you ride down the course. I think Sega definitely got the most that they could out of the space available. As you might expect, with a limited cartridge size, the music and sound effects aren't anything special. For most of the time that you're playing the game, you'll just be hearing the same track which plays during races. There's of course other themes for parts of the game when you're not racing, and all the music is fine overall, but don't be expecting a lot of variety here. The sound effects get the job done, but just like the music, they won't amaze and are pretty limited in scope. Also, despite Enduro Racer getting a Japanese release, it predated the FM sound unit, so there's no alternate soundtrack here, just standard PSG, which is fine, because again, any complaint I might have isn't with the quality of the sound, it's just the limited amount present. Even though both versions of the game are relatively easy, you do still have to pay attention or else you won't make it to the end, and I appreciated the fact that I did have to actually try, with gameplay that was just challenging enough to make me learn where certain spots were on courses and plan out how many points I needed to save for upgrades versus repair. Also, I'd definitely say that I found the Japanese version more difficult, with some of the tracks that were cut being slightly trickier, but neither will give an experienced gamer any trouble. While I actually quite like Enduro Racer and enjoyed playing it for the video, due to the decision to effectively cut out half the game stateside, and the fact that it can be completed without much trouble, I'm giving Enduro Racer 2 stars. But for the Japanese version that actually retains all of the original tracks, I'm giving that one 3. If you decide you like what you see here, I definitely recommend tracking that version down instead, as it's just simply a better overall experience.
Okay, and that's it for Enduro Racer for the Master System. Or maybe the Mark III, I guess, depending on which version of the game that you're playing. I'll be honest, things have been pretty busy around Zilog and Moto headquarters recently, what with some of the recent traveling and conventions and that sort of thing, and then also some other things that just happen to be going on at the house. So I want to thank Dudley of Yestrazine for pointing out that the Japanese version was a little different. You know, I might have figured that out on my own via the research that I usually do for these videos, but then again, the way things have been recently, I could have missed it as well. So again, thanks to him and to all of you out there that comment on these videos and posts. I clearly do not know everything, and I'm making up a lot of this as I go along, so all the help on this journey is definitely welcomed. Now, next time on Zilog and Moto, well, it's a game that I can honestly say that I don't expect to be anywhere near as exciting as Enduro Racer. But it should be entertaining at least. Or maybe I should say edutaining. Okay, that was kind of dumb. Let's be honest, I think the most exciting or entertaining thing about this next game is that its source material is connected to Nelson Mandela and underwear by people that clearly had lead paint in their nurseries. But hey, if I can review the same Jeopardy game 3 times, I think I can make it through this next one without losing my mind. I hope. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 235. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.